An orca stranded and crying out for her pod, trapped on sharp rocks. Her family couldn't reach her, but what rescuers did next is truly remarkable. It was early one July morning in 2015 when Eric Keane, a whale researcher, set sail around British Columbia. He was on his vessel, the Bangarang, studying fin whales when he heard the heart-wrenching cries coming from a small, jagged outcropping on the shore of Andrew Rocks. There, wedged between the sharp rocks and barely in the water, was a young orca in distress. Around C:30 am, Eric reached out to Whale Point, a local environmental group. His description painted a clear picture for the orca experts. This young female must have miscalculated while hunting seals with her pod, ending up trapped as the tide receded. Eric, a familiar and trusted colleague of Janie Ray and Hermann Muter, knew the situation was urgent. Janie and Hermann, returning from Hartley Bay, immediately set course to join Eric in Squally Channel. They also called on the Gitga'at Guardians at Hartley Bay and Fisheries and Oceans Canada D for additional support. As they raced north, the rescuers understood the gravity of the young orca's plight and knew they had to act fast to save her. Meanwhile, Eric and his crew approached the stranded orca, determined to help her without causing any harm. They kept their distance at first, not wanting to startle her into injuring herself further on the sharp, barnacle-covered rocks. She was already bleeding a bit from her pectoral area and tail. When Janie and Hermann arrived, they shared the guidance they had received from John Ford and Paul Cottrell of DFO via satellite phone. The key was to keep the orca cool and wet until the tide rose again, which wouldn't be for another 8 hours. So the marathon rescue began. Understandably, the young orca was anxious and scared, surrounded by humans while trapped and in pain. Her breathing was quick and shallow, and gravity was making it harder for her. Thinking on his feet, Eric rigged up a makeshift water pump from a hose and some duct tape. He worked the pump from the back of the island, while Hermann used the hose to douse the orca with cooling seawater. The rescuers soaked sheets in seawater and gently draped them over the orca's body. As they worked, they noticed her cries quieting and her breathing becoming calm. Slowly, it seemed, the orca began to trust these humans who were doing everything they could to comfort her, while her own family could only call to her from the nearby waters. The rescuers took turns pumping seawater over the young orca and replacing the sheets covering her with freshly soaked, cooler ones. They noticed her dorsal fin drying out and used a pillowcase from Eric's boat to keep it wet. Luckily, the morning had been grey and overcast, but as noon approached, the clouds dispersed and the heat intensified. Despite the rising temperature, everyone worked tirelessly to keep the orca cool and wet. They replaced the dry, warm coverings with cooler, wetter ones, dousing her with seawater from the pump to prevent her from drying out. They couldn't help but think how dire the situation might have been if Eric hadn't heard her cries. At first they didn't cover her head, fearing it would make her panic. But the fierce midday sun made it necessary to protect her delicate skin. Janie watched as one of the team members carefully approached the orca. Inching slowly into the water in front of her, he gently placed a cool, wet sheet over her head, taking great care not to cover her blowhole. The orca's youth and relatively small size worked in her favour. At just 9 years old, she weighed around 7,000 pounds, about the size of a hippo or 7 cows. An older, larger orca might not have survived the pressure on her lungs until the next tide. Eventually, the water pump broke beyond repair, no matter how much duct tape Eric used. This could have been devastating, but just then the sea began to rise again. After 9 exhausting hours, the tide had risen enough to start setting the young orca free. The rescuers removed the sheets and the pillowcase from her dorsal fin. They knew it was time for her to swim out of her rocky prison on her own. Not wanting to startle her into injuring herself further, they walked away and climbed a nearby cliff to watch and wait. All of them sent her their wishes for strength, hoping she had the ability to free herself. The water level slowly began to rise, creeping up the young orca's body until it finally covered her. As it did, she cried out again. This time, her vocalizations seemed different, almost excited, as if she knew freedom was near. Yet she remained still, occasionally lifting her tail but making no attempt to swim. The rescuers grew worried. Was she more injured than they had thought, too exhausted to make that final push? They realized they had to trust her instincts. By moving her tail, she was testing the water depth. When she was sure it was safe, she suddenly struck out with 2 powerful thrusts. Free from the rocks, she sped through the sea. From their boats and the rocks around, her rescuers cheered, "You go, girl." The joy and relief were palpable. After more than 9 hours of hard work and tender care, they had kept her alive and well until she could return to her pod. Eric placed a hydrophone in the water, capturing the orca's calls as she vocalized over and over, seeking a response from her family. For a moment, her voice was the only one, and a shadow of doubt crept in. Where was her pod? Had they given up on her after so long? Had they mourned her loss and moved on? Then faint replies echoed from a distance. Relief washed over the listeners. The young orca heard her family's calls too, swimming toward them with joy and the thrill of release. The rescuers stood together, overwhelmed with pride and emotion. They had given their all, and it had paid off. They sighed with relief, knowing this experience would stay with them forever. What a great ending! If you loved the story, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you next time.